Good evening, everyone. I'm Sophie McPherson, Sales Director for Cornerstone Press. Thank you for coming to our special event and celebrating the release of 3 new Cornerstone Press titles. Before we get to the authors and their work, I would like to thank a number of people for their support of the press in various ways. Director and publisher, Dr. Ross Tangadal, editorial director, Brett Hill, senior editors, Ellie Atkinson and Paige Beaver, executive editors, Jeff Snowbarger and Frisia McKee, Ingram Lighting Source, our distributor, interim chancellor, Pratima Gandhi, provost Lavon Cornell Swanson, Andrew Bratz of UWSP Financial Operations, Dean Joshua Hagen, Carrie Hutton, and Carrie Ziolkowski of the College of Letters and Science, Assistant Dean Tobias Barsky of the School of Humanities and Global Studies, Chair Rebecca Stevens of the English Department, as well as the entire faculty and staff of the department, Lindsay Sheaver and Samantha Petch of the School of Humanities and Global Studies, Eor Brodaszewski and Jacob Weisbrod of the university's IT department, Carrie Heiber, Brittany Kaminsky, and Mies Vang of the University Communications and Marketing, Robin Spindler, Kathy Stedel, and their staff at Point Print and Design Studio, Sue Fisher and Eva Hathaway of UWSP Facility Services and Central Stores, Katie Horn of the UWSP Store and Text Rental, the Bookshop Co-op of Stevens Point, and Bound to Happen Bookstore of Stevens Point. Our press would not be possible without the energetic participation from our diverse student staff, comprised mostly of English majors and minors at UWSP. We would especially like to thank our current executive staff, Senior Managing Editor Carly Harpold, Managing Editors Lily Kolbeck and Brianna Loving, Production Director Allison Lang, Production Editors Abby Paulson and Ari Pender, Media Director Sam Bjork, Sales Director, that's me, and Sales Managers Madison Schultz and Autumn Vine. It is now my privilege to introduce our special guests for the evening. Calvin Mills hosts the Raymond Carver Podcast, a chapbook of creative non-essays, a handful of tragic days, won the 2024 Eggtooth Any Genre Chapbook Contest. His work has appeared in short story, Weird Tales from the South, short-form creative writing, A Writer's Guide and Anthology, and Youth Culture and Social Change, Making a Difference by Making a Noise. His writing awards include a Meritorious Achievement Award from the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival as a playwright for Freak Like Me, the musical. He teaches writing at Peninsula College in Port Angeles, Washington. He is the author of The Caged Man, available in December 2025. Barry Pierce won the Nelson Algren Award for fiction in 2019. His fiction has been published in Colorado Review, Cimarron Review, KJBB, and the Chicago Tribune, and elsewhere. He grew up on the south side of Chicago, the son of immigrant parents in a diverse working-class neighborhood. He still lives in Chicago, where he works as a ghostwriter of nonfiction books. He is the author of The Plan of Chicago, available next week. Steve Fox is the award-winning author of Sometimes Creek, winner of American Book Fest Best Book Award, finalist for the Chicago Writers Association Book of the Year, and longlisted for the Ida Feber Book Award. He's also the recipient of the Rick Bass Montana Prize for Fiction and the Zona Gale Award for Short Fiction. He lives in Wisconsin with his wife, 3 sons, and 1 dog. He is the author of These Are My People, available in December. Each author will read a brief portion of their book, which will be followed by a Q&A and book signing immediately after. So without further ado, please welcome Calvin Mills.
Put on my timer here so I do not overrun. So thank you for being here. You may or may not know this, but we're sitting in the back in the green room and discussing Cornerstone Press, and I, for one, am very impressed what they're doing for the American short story. To take the American short story seriously, to support authors, to build such a stunning and large body of work as well and as quickly as they are, it's wonderful. So I do appreciate you all deeply. I'm going to take you on a quick tour here. This is a funny little book. It's a trip, quite literally, and it's a little trippy because it's kind of strange. But these are 13 stories set in half dozen countries around the world. And I'm going to begin with what might have been the title story of this collection. It's called The Affable Corpse. I probably shouldn't summarize the story because if I did, you would never buy this book. You would be frightened. Some of you might get up and leave the room. But I will say there's some lovely little villages in the hills outside Bogota, Colombia, where the temperature only varies by a few degrees from season to season, and even from high to low from day to day. And here we find the main character going to visit her, for lack of a better word, boyfriend. She's about 80 years old. She let her fingertips ride along the rough surface of the plaster wall through the dark living room, then down the hall past the many photographs of the corpse with local celebrities, important foreigners, and the 3 most recent village mayors. His bedroom was the second on the left. His bedroom, his kitchen, and his living room. They were all his, but he only used the one room. Due to his miraculous preservation, some visitors argued for sainthood. Not for the soul the corpse had once contained, but for the corpse himself. Others believed the impromptu cleaning solution the undertaker concocted to combat a ripe smell hardened to something like a thin veneer which kept moisture inside the body and gave the corpse a lifelike quality. They said this fact, combined with the cool weather near Bogota, accidentally produced a rudimentary form of mummification, with both skeptics and religious people curious, yet able to place their faith where they liked to place it best. The village became quite used to living with the corpse. When it came down to it, they couldn't bear to put that grin underground. Some said it would be cruel, others selfish. Some even said it would be like burying a man alive. Her eyes were somewhat adjusted to the blue darkness by the time she reached the bedroom door, so she was no longer shuffling forward by touch alone. There was a dim light in the room from the window, the one partially obscured by bougainvillea. To her left, she could see a ghostly pale image of his face above the bedsheet in the thin wool blanket that had been pulled up to his neck. From where she stood, she couldn't see his famous grin. She suffered a small tremor upon seeing the pale face in the dark and felt something quick and light in her chest. She'd felt this sensation many years before. While acting as her father's caretaker after his stroke, she sometimes entered his room to find him motionless in his bed. She remembered this crippling feeling, the fear that he had passed, that his life and suffering had come to an end. But her father held on an impossibly long time. He held on until she was too old to be married. As she entered the corpse's room and shuffled toward him, she saw him grinning at her and was reassured. Of course he was dead, and she knew that. But his being dead wasn't like the death of others. And because of her feelings for him, she worried about the many ways he might cease to exist, the ways he too might be taken away. The first story is called The Borrowed Dress. I went to Costa Rica, and the story stuck with me. A woman was volunteering with young women who were, I guess you could say, affected by sexual tourism. And she remembered this pair of sisters, and some European man flew into town, bought one of them an expensive dress, and that dress was enough to not only date her, but date the sister. So they would take turns wearing the dress. It's called The Borrowed Dress. From the gazebo, I look down the hill, past the North American mansion compounds. I scour the stubble of tiny matchbox buildings of far-off San Jose. If I had a telescope, I would use it to search the streets. I would use it to find my sister. I can't think with this wind. All I can do is sit here and eat guanabana and pate, drink liquor blended with ice and strawberries. His Nicaraguan help prepares anything we ask for. When they serve it, they smile. They have endless smiles for our cebolla. His life here is a vacation, food, gambling, girls. The wind knows I want to save my sister more than I want to save myself. The wind takes away what's left of the pleasure I get from sitting here. It takes away the pleasure I once felt when I wore the yellow dress. The wind howls through the streets of San Jose, up the hill to Escazú. It buffets the mango tree and rattles the bamboo. It whips my hair into my eyes. My hair bites my cheeks, slaps the skin above my breasts, enters my parted lips. The wind tears leaves from the trees. One gust brings a leaf to touch down momentarily on the lacquered table. Another gust pulls it away. Meanwhile, the white orchids float on the surface. They ride the tension. I cannot. This glass bowl is almost a globe. The weight of the water holds it to the table. The wind cannot carry it off, so it howls. It moans over the small hole at the top. So in this story, 3 young men on an unnamed Caribbean island find a small sea stack, the little tiny islands off the coast. And they go explore there, and they stumble upon a hallucinogen. And being enterprising young men, they decide to produce and market this hallucinogen. And one of the boys sees this as a possible escape from the island, as a possible means of exile. When Chin Chin, Davy, and Speedo first crawled out of the water onto the tiny island, they were breathing hard from the swim. Their eyes were wild with anticipation. Speedo didn't know what they'd find, but the possibilities seemed endless. He imagined pirate gold, stashes of fireworks, illegal weapons, or panther bones, maybe even pictures of naked girls. Panting, they raced to the top, smashing branches aside and stomping delicate flowers that grew along the ground. They overturned rocks and climbed into the branches of all the large trees. They scoured every part of the tiny island, looking for indications of previous explorers, initials carved by lovers into tree trunks, unnatural rock piles that might hint at shallow graves containing bodies they could dig up to rob of jewelry. The boys overlooked nothing on the small island, and they found nothing, not even a bit of fishing tackle or a turtle shell. With their sense of adventure dulled and their search for treasure abandoned, they gathered under the shade of the large tree at the pinnacle. The boys sat quietly for a few minutes. Speedo looked out at the open ocean and dreamed for the first time of leaving Costa Negra. He wanted to extend the feeling of endless possibility that had swelled in his chest when he pulled himself, wet and tired, from the sea to set foot for the first time on ground he imagined did not belong to his country. Speedo knew that for the poor on his island, they never traveled. He also knew that if they'd left, like Chin Chin's father had done, they would never come back, not even for their own mother's funerals. It was after a handful of quiet moments, while their stillness and the absence of any breeze allowed the musty smell of their sun-warmed skin to rise to from their thin, tanned bodies to their nostrils. It was after their minds had wandered away from hopes of discovering anything new on their unnamed island. It was after their breathing faded from deep, panting wheezes to slow, shallow whispers that the Santo appeared. We have about 1 minute. Let's do this one last. So in Nikolai's plan, a young man befriends an octogenarian neighbor who used to work for NASA. And he doesn't realize this, but that man is secretly building a spaceship, which may or may not work, maybe a stroke of genius, maybe just a normal stroke. We don't know, but it's called Nikolai's Plan. Liam Stein had been driven out of his house in a moment of suffocating boredom after his television quit working. He placed an aluminum lawn chair in the center of his fenced-in backyard. With his feet kicked out and his head tilted back, Liam fell into the old dreams of space. There was no cloud cover, and the stars were white against the black heavens. Because the wind had died, it was a warm night, and he was cozy, with his hands crammed into the pockets of his jeans, and with the hood of his sweatshirt pulled up over his short blonde hair. Liam had once spent a night like this on the lawn of his cousin's house when he was 15. It was his aunt who suggested he and Tina take lawn chairs and sleeping bags out to watch the meteor shower. Liam resented his aunt later when she discovered the two of them in the same sleeping bag. After all, stargazing was her idea. Liam held close to his heart a fairly obvious theory, which supposed that any terribly important event in a person's life was constructed entirely by the aligning of multiple templates of coincidence. This multiple layer sense of chance is what he blamed for his attraction to his cousin. When he discovered that she felt the same way, that all-important coincidental template exhilarated the 15-year-old Liam. But there was an additional template of chance to be stacked on his pile, one that would contradict his happiness. Unfortunately for Liam, the last template depicted his aunt's decision to bring out a thermos of hot chocolate at the very moment when he and his cousin had at first clumsily, then successfully intermingled their private parts and begun to wiggle. It was this theory about coincidence Liam was contemplating when he was interrupted from his search for Aldebaran by a single frog which had fallen from the dark sky and landed at his feet. Thank you all.
All right. Next up, we have Bari Pierce.
Thanks. That was great. Thank you also to Ross and Brett, Sophie, and everybody at Cornerstone. It's really been amazing and terrific, and I don't think Random House would be better. Like, you guys are nimble, and it's just been such a good experience. Most of my stories are pretty long, and so they're a little less suited to a reading, but I'll give you a little background and read an excerpt. This story called Enumerator is about a woman named Margaret from Poland. She meets an American guy in Poland. They hit it off. She steals a bunch of money, which is how they finance eloping to America. They're married for 20 years, and then he leaves her. And so that's where this section starts. And she becomes an enumerator, which is just, if anyone's ever worked for the census, you go around counting the people who didn't get counted. And what else? There's a form that you use called the Enumerator Questionnaire, which they call an EQ, so just so you know what that means. And April 1st is Census Day, so everybody gets counted on where they lived on April 1st. There's a lot of valuable civic information here, apart from the reading. So, and then, there's a mention of the Green Gate, which is just a thing in Gdansk. It was built as sort of a palace, but it's a popular sort of meeting place in Poland. So she's at a building called Historia Commons, just trying to count people there. I returned to Historia Commons a fifth night to complete one last EQ. Outside the apartment, I crouched over my bag, groping for forms and noticed for the first time the motif I had walked on all week, a faded pattern of linked, ever-widening circles on the blue carpet. The door opened and jolted me out of myself. An elderly man with thick glasses thrust his head into mine as if surprising a burglar planning her next theft. "What is it? I thought you were my son," he said. "Are you lost?" "I work for the census." I could feel my heart's pumping as if he switched it on when he opened the door. "We didn't get your form. I have to ask you some questions." Yes, he said in Polish. "Come in. The kettle is on." No respondent had yet invited me into his home. As we stepped inside, I asked if he had lived at this address on April 1st. Yes, but sit," he said. "I must make the tea first." I sat on a long vinyl couch with metal legs that looked like it belonged in an office waiting room. Next to the kitchen entrance, where he disappeared, a small table with 2 wooden chairs pressed against the wall. 2 places were elaborately set: forks, knives, plates, bowls, red cloth napkins. It was late for dinner, but maybe the sun was bringing it. I did not smell cooking. "Hello," I called. "Sorry, but I can't linger." The colonel, that's her boss, had given me a new stack of EQs that day, and I was anxious to start them. I would come back another time. Just as I had not possessed the stamina for impossible lines in Gdansk, I didn't have the patience to sit here waiting for who knew what. I made motions to leave, but chewed my lip and continued sitting, from stubbornness more than anything, though maybe some slight curiosity too. The phrase "God's waiting room," I once heard a comedian describe Florida this way, came to me for some reason as I fidgeted on the uncomfortable couch. Yes, he called back, "soon." The minute hand of a large black and white clock that might have come from the same office as the couch did not move steadily, but sprang forward in surprising increments. There were no photos from the last 40 years on the walls, but older pictures featured my host with, I guessed, his wife and son. A kettle shrieked, and a long while later, he teetered in with a tray conveying cups, sugar, milk, a teapot, and a box of fig cookies. I almost leaped up to take it, but stopped myself, sensing that interference could create a disaster. He set the tray on the coffee table with surprising grace. "Thank you." I sipped my tea and businesslike took out a pencil. "Does someone usually live at this address, or is it a seasonal residence or a vacation home?" He gestured with uplifted hands at the small, cluttered room. "Sorry, they make us..." I started to take out the list of who should be counted, a sheet all subjects were supposed to get, but then put it away. How many people lived here on April 1? Only me and my son. No other relatives, roommates, foster children, others without a permanent place? I abandoned the script partly because we spoke in Polish, but sped through a version of the standard question, scribbling in a 2 before he answered. "He's all the people I have." "You are the renter here? What is your name?" "You are from Gdańsk," he said. How could you tell? I did not want to get lost in a rambling dialogue with the old man, but he surprised me. Poland is not like America. There isn't really a Gdansk accent. I lived there after the war. My wife was from Gdańsk. I worked in scavenging, scrap metal, a big business then. I nodded, losing my place on the form. "Sorry, I need your name." "Arvad," he said, pointing impatiently at the page in my lap, as if it should be there. "Arvad Nauczycielowicz." I printed carefully as he spelled it. Frank Hard complained about my handwriting, which spilled out of boxes and took serious work to interpret. "What was your age on April 1st? You know the Green Gate? I met her there. Well, stole her." "Who?" "My wife. Her husband, the first one, not me, was a violinist, but he was blinded in the war. He couldn't work, so he played outside the Green Gate for coins. Always the Grand Caprice Fantastique. Why that piece, I don't know. The same every time. His playing was perfect, technically, but he only played the notes, if you follow. No feeling in between. Great artists love the spaces, too. They live in between. Strange he played that piece because Caprice was just what he lacked. Well, maybe the war did that to him, too. She brought him bread and tea most afternoons, my wife, his wife. She was his wife then. I used to wait around just to see her, but we never spoke. I didn't have the nerve. He cursed her if she was late, something awful, right there in the street. Even when she was on time, he found things to complain about. Bitch this and whore that, such language. Well, he'd been blinded, but still. She never said much. Sometimes when he was at her, she made faces or flapped her tongue, mocking him when she thought no one could see. I saw. You know those big doorways on the Green Gate? I used to read or sketch in a notebook just inside one of them, waiting for her to arrive, an hour, 2, sometimes more. I felt guilty spying like that, but what a thrill to watch her unseen. When she made those faces, it felt so intimate, like watching the woman in the next apartment undress on nights she forgets to draw the blinds. I sighed as he pointed at the window where a neighbor, apparently disrobed in plain view. I need to know your age on April 1st, I said. You think I'm crazy. You're right. She made me that way. I haven't told you how beautiful she was. Then maybe you would understand. You know Audrey Hepburn? Like that kind of beauty, but with better proportions. He described her voluptuous form with his hands. When were you born? Grace, intelligence, well, you could see it a mile away, and beauty itself. Imagine this woman, his muse when he played for the symphony, bringing him bread most days, still full of love, still showing up, and he curses her in the streets because he's blind? So what? Lots of musicians are blind, and don't they say some even play better for it? He could still see her in his mind, young, beautiful, naked if he wanted. I would have traded sight for such an image. He might have seen her unhappiness if he tried, all that she lacked. I mean, he couldn't see, obviously, but he might have sensed it. Well, and maybe it's easy for me to say. I watched her every move hidden from that doorway. But you never spoke? I followed her one day. I didn't plan to, but when she left, I found myself trailing her home, 3 kilometers maybe, more. Down Chlebnica, past St. Mary of the Assumption, on to Pivna. On a bench outside a small, nameless church, she sat and cried. I almost went to her, but how could I, a stranger? Even if I'd known her, interrupting would have felt like a violation. Crying only made her more beautiful. There was something sacred about it. Watching her, I began to tear up myself. I admitted, a grown man crying in the street. I followed her the next day from the Green Gate, and the next, every day she showed up after that. I don't know when she discovered me, but she began taking tortuous detours through the city center, lingering in the long markets, strolling out the channels, weaving through the maze of narrow lanes. Some day she took me up and down the same roads, looping back as if she'd lost something valuable and was determined to find it. On others, she circled her destination for hours, testing how long or how well I could follow. I'd come to Gdańsk for the first time from Bergen-Belsen, the displaced persons camp the British wanted us to call home. We refused, because a man I knew had work in the city. I got lost every day. After a while, though, I knew I could find my way back to the center from almost anywhere. But when did you talk to her? She sat one day on the same bench outside that church, St. Nobody's, where I'd seen her cry. She looked at me and smiled. We'd exchanged glances, even brushed sleeves once or twice when she turned and passed close, leading me back the way we came. This was different, such a look. I felt like her eyes were inside of mine. I was ecstatic and terrified. I couldn't move. And then she waved. He waved as he said this, and his sleeve flapped open, exposing the numbers on his arm. The blue ink blurred into his wrinkled skin, but I could make out vague figures, hand-painted, hand-printed, crude, slightly larger toward his elbow. We were strangers but intimate, knew each other well, yet not at all. It felt like, tell me, I said, aiming for the same mix of humility and authority I used knocking on doors. You'll laugh. It felt like I'd been trailing my soul through the city and finally found it, or was found by it. He grew shy. You see, I told you, like a bad movie. No, that's a beautiful way to think of it. We sat in silence. 86, he said. Excuse me? March 7th, 1924. I was born, I'm 86. What about her husband? You came to Chicago with her after that? What? No. He no longer seemed interested in his own story. No, Haifa. She left him and we went to Haifa in 1947. She was Catholic, I was Jewish, not an easy thing in Gdańsk. Going there wasn't my smartest plan, though I wouldn't have met her otherwise. Americans don't know there were pogroms in Poland after the war also. A beautiful city, Gdańsk. In a way, my life started there, but full of death and division too. Most Jews had already left. So did we, once we saved a little. I had enough of war and death. Of course, fighting broke out in Israel, well, Palestine then, as soon as we arrived. We tried to arrange our next move better, the trip here, but there was so much we didn't know. Some things you can't plan. His story finished, he looked drained of life. He glanced at the big clock on the wall. Where was your son born? In Chicago. He would be 53. My wife would be 91 if she was alive. But your son lives here with you. I glanced at the table set for two. What? Yes, he's here with me. He looked at the clock again. I completed the EQ, thanked him. I wanted to ask more about the concentration camp. Why tell so much but not that? The move to Chicago, his wife's death, his son. Also, I wanted to leave. There was something unhealthy about the place. The air felt thick and stale, as if windows had not been opened in a long time. Gathering my things, I noticed a fine layer of dust on one of the plates set for dinner. Had he invented the son's imminent arrival? Was his child estranged or gone? A sense of anticipation permeated the room, and I imagined Arvad Nauczycielewicz waiting here day after day, as patiently as he had for his wife at the Green Gate, only for a child who would never return. Thanks.
Finally, we have Steve Fox.
Thanks. I'd like to echo my colleagues' remarks about Cornerstone Press. Thank you for all the work from Dr. Tangadal, Sophie, Sam, Brett, all the editors, all the hard work in the back and forth. It's just been a pleasure to work with this press. This is my second book. We chatted about this a little earlier, but independent presses really are doing the hard work. Is supporting authors who take risks and don't necessarily write formulaic fiction, but rather trippy and gritty things. And this book is sort of like that too. These are my people, actually preceded Sometimes Creek, all those stories. And the reason probably was because the stories just weren't ready yet. But also, they belonged with each other, so I kind of needed them all to work. The stories are linked, but they're not interdependent. And I tend to picture them as sort of like unique tiles of a mosaic. Each one is its own individual image, but pull away from that collection of images and they slide together to form a little larger picture. When I look at story threads, I see things as kind of one large continuum, and sometimes it's kind of hard to shut off when I go to a place like a shopping mall or a supermarket. You know, the narratives get really tight and close and almost claustrophobic in one's head. And these story threads, I kind of envision them like solutions across a crossword puzzle. One comes down, another one comes across. And there's that moment when the shopping carts bump and the claustrophobia ends and the story breaks open. And it's that one rectangle where the two solutions, those two story threads, converge, that they have that one letter in common. And then the stories continue on their way. The solutions cross and down the page. And that's how a lot of my stories go. I never really let go of a single character. I always wonder about the guy who got bumped into in the parking lot. I'm going to read for a few minutes from a story called Rings. And I'm going to start from the beginning, so I don't need to really drop you into any context here. But I will take a sip of water first. This has been great, by the way. Outside there's a jazz quartet playing. There's a gallery opening. There's hors d'oeuvres stationed and butlered. It's all for you. It's all for us. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, this has been quite the event that we come parading through. We're just writers, you know. We write things in books. So there's a story called Rings. Love is a many splendored, murderous thing, as you will soon see. Harriet Boslam understood this, which is why she murdered her husband, Emmett. It was what he wanted and what a good wife would do for the man she loved. And Harriet Boslam, a nationally renowned professor of chemistry at University of Wisconsin, Noisy Creek, was a very, very good wife indeed. Another cat came to die on the frozen turf outside Harriet Boslam's window 20 minutes after dawn. By now, she'd come to expect the sight of one or two newly dead cats around sunup in the backyard of her yellow house on Vincent Street. And by now, after so many cats, the entire thing had gotten old. She watched this last one walk into the yard and trace a large ring around the pile of other dead cats, now numbering too many to quickly count, before selecting a spot to settle in to die, fused to the bare earth in fresh, dead livor mortis. Here we go again, Harriet cawed, tearing at a wedge of dried venison with her teeth. She looked across the room in the direction of the hallway and announced with a sigh, "I'm going to go have a look." She cleared her throat of a large amount of viscid mucus. You never know," she grunted, pressing a palm into her lower back as she raised herself into a standing stretch. "This one might be tagged, honey." "Yeah, you never know," a much younger woman's voice echoed back through the house. "Makes you wonder," Harriet said again. She first muttered this remark to herself 3 weeks prior while observing cat number 7 arrive, coil up, and die minutes later out there in her yard, connecting itself end to end to 2 other frozen dead cats. It propped its chin upon the haunch of the cat to the front and curled its tail around behind to touch the snout of another, deliberately filling a gap between the 2 others, completing the perimeter of a rough circle approximately 8 feet in diameter. Cat number 7 promptly froze directly to the ground, as unmovable as a protruding oak root. She couldn't even budge it with a spade. "Lends to their mystique, perhaps," the voice said. "Don't forget, some people think cats are people spirits on the inside." Harriet loosed a derisive snort, chewing her morning jerk really hungry and in chunks. She stopped abruptly when a sharp fragment jammed up along a gum line between a pair of teeth. Yeah, she called out, rolling her eyes and moving the tip of her tongue to the jerky sliver. "Ask a dog person. Dogs are people too, they all say." She coughed noisily. "Bullocks. Dogs and cats are mere mammals." With some effort, she swallowed the dried meat and raised her teacup, "Just like us." The source of the younger woman's voice stared out, alarmed, from behind the looking glass in the back hallway. "Oh my," she said, watching her hands touch one, then the other bare shoulder. "What does that make me?" Harriet looked over at the reflection of the much younger woman behind the framed glass on the wall. "Gorgeous." She smiled, tugging a tooth, and looked back out the window at the latest cat. Harriet slipped her feet into a pair of sandals and pulled on Emmett's heavy leather Air Force jacket over her nightgown and stepped out into the very cold, still morning to examine the newest dead arrival. Naked blades of crystallized grass snapped and shattered beneath each step. Her breath hung in stiff plumes in the calm morning air as she eased toward the woods on the west end of her city lot. Beyond the woods, Noisy Creek chattered cold and swift and loud over the rocks and boulders in its rush to join the St. Croix River a few miles to the south and west. She rested a bare foot on the back of the newest cat, dead on its side and still warm to the touch. Her toes glided through the soft tufts of fur and pressed down on its rib cage. Ectoplasmic threads of gossamer steam looped up from the cat's nostrils and slowly coiled and glided towards the house, knifing through the winter air and finally dissipating near the slender trunk of a young maple near her back porch. Beyond the young maple tree, a man and woman on the sidewalk exchanged much livelier breaths, and they conversed in cold, poofy dialogue bubbles. Harry penciled in an imagined conversation into their translucent plumes, framing the couple onto the page of the Sunday morning comic strip, with one bare foot still resting on the fleeting heat of the cat's furry rib cage. Woman: "Got one at the Walgreens then." Man: "A flu shot?" Woman: Now, a palm reading. Man, oh, geez. Her gaze returned to the cat beneath her foot. Cold, still morning, January, Noisy Creek, Wisconsin. She wiggled the toes of her other foot, the bare beneath the straps of the slip-on sandal. A Walgreens palm reading, she chuckled, of all things. She glanced at cat number one, its hazel eyes now long frozen solid, two freezer-burned ice orbs peering, stunned, across the lawn through the spindly winter shrubbery toward Vinnie Street. She wasn't sure about cat number two and when it came and how it acted or behaved prior to hooking up with cat number one to die with its nose in cat number one's rump. Cat number two had appeared in the middle of the night, and Harry wouldn't have noticed at all if it weren't for the jeering blue jays calling out in distress or delight at the sight of the new dead thing at first light. Cat number three had wandered into Harriet's yard, practically lost, like some stoned adolescent boy. The cat stopped mid-stride and looked directly at Harriet, who was reading inside at the kitchen table, as if to ask, "So, is this like the right place? I'm looking for like a string of dead cats." To which Harriet calmly indicated with a slight tilt of her head, channeling her brainwaves down an invisible conduit, "Yep, it's over there." The cat moved on and finally saw the other two sprawled out end to end to form the beginning of a crescent. Number three glanced back towards Harriet as if to say, "Looks like I found it. Thanks," and continued. It lay down and connected to cat number two, completing a perfect half moon of felines. Minutes later, she set down her book, slipped on her sandals, and threw a coat over her shoulders and walked outside to check it for a tag. "No one ever lays claim to the damn thing," she said, giving the cat a solid punt. It didn't budge, having already adhered so firmly to the ground as to practically become part of the earth itself. Harriet rubbed her foot and cussed. The next group of cats settled in inside the first seven, forming a concentric circle within. Then the next group coiled inside those, and so on until the entire area of the circle filled with dead, frozen cats. "Rings," Harriet croaked, shaking her head in the cafe across the street. The waitress poured coffee. "They're coming," she said to the waitress casually, as if noticing that the leaves were clinging to the branches a week or so longer than expected this fall, "to die in rings." Harriet drank coffee from a cup fashioned after Elvis Presley. The waitress asked about waiting for spring to bury them. Harriet nodded. She liked the waitress. "Thankfully, it's been so mercifully cold," Harriet told her, "so they won't stink up the place." Everything else about the cat occurrence was unexplainable, so it was nice to have something, some sort of pattern to cling to in the middle of what had become a bit of a curious situation and posed something of a logistics problem for a woman living alone, now retired. Rings of dead cats in her backyard, all of which would have been highly unusual for anyone were it not for the fact that it happened in nearly identical fashion in Harriet's backyard the previous year, except with dogs. All clean, groomed, and well-cared-for dogs. One short-haired one even had worn a green doggy sweater vest the day it decided to wander in. "But it's not the same as a dog," Harriet sighed. Now pacing through her house, she paused, hands on hips, looking into the looking glass hung on the wall connecting the piano room to the library. "I know," her reflection said. She twisted the ends of a length of copper-colored hair beneath a thumb and forefinger. "The dogs make connecting rings, not concentric ones, by those two ash trees where the woods get thick, about 25 in all." She glanced out from her side of the mirror toward the cat stack and folded her arms. "I was here for that. Remember, Harriet?" Harriet laughed like a raven. "Of course, honey." She glanced quickly back at her reflection and smiled. She liked how she looked 30 years ago. Her reflection smiled back at her, liking what she saw 30 or so years later. Harriet had hoped this winter would be different. She glanced off to her right, where the dog ditch, as she called it, had been dug and subsequently filled with dead dogs, all of which came for their final nap during the dead of winter, too. She hired a college kid to bury them once the weather broke. Same kid who painted her house the summer before. The quality of his work was adequate, she supposed, though it took him the entire summer to finish painting. Harriet knew he was simply showing off for the passing college girls who hung around for summer session. He, Lance, would strip down to his cut-off jeans to ripple and flex in the sun as he painted. A ripple and flex and glisten in the sun he indeed did. A strapping, gleamy lad with wavy, sun-bleached blonde hair and dark walnut eyes. Harriet's reflection practically leapt out from behind her frame to accost the boy, but that wasn't necessary. Lance clambered in through the frame of the looking glass eagerly enough each day during his lengthy lunch break. A couple years before the dogs, it was herds of bunnies that came to her yard to die, and then prior to that it had been squirrels, though she believed that case to be logically explained easily enough. The squirrels dying en masse in her yard was merely coincidental to losing an enormous oak tree to a powerful storm that hit exactly on the summer solstice. Once the fallen tree was cleared, each adult squirrel continued to leap from tree to tree as its years of developed muscle memory of the habit of daily routine had trained it, only to leap out and grasp at a sudden nothingness where a connecting tree should have sprawled out across the backyard to receive it. One by one, each squirrel fell straight down to the ground, dead in one thump, on a rock-hard yard 40 feet below, dying hard like an old habit. Took about a week. That season's new kits seemed to be the only recipients of that one enormous oak tree connecting the woods to the other side of the house is gone memo, and managed to circumvent the new chasm and therefore a premature and ugly end. That year, Harriet simply threw each dead squirrel in the noisy creek behind her house. Done. Unlike the squirrels, however, the dogs eventually required burial once the weather broke a few months later. So did her husband, who died in her yard the winter many years before the squirrels. The dogs, very mysterious. They stumped her. The squirrels, easily explainable by the missing oak limbs, the broken bridge that had once spanned her backyard, and the occasional infrequent bird, which she until now discounted completely as a thing that had come to die in her back lot. Harriet had chalked up to her very old and very protected window cleaning elixir involving lemons, vinegar, and newspapers. Harriet was a chemist after all, and had insisted if she couldn't manage a decent window cleaning solution, she'd demand the regents at UW-Madison rescind her degrees. Bunnies? Well, who knows? Bunnies were just dumb. Could have been some citywide bunny blight or brain malaise that got into them. These cats, though, she was still unsure. This felt a lot, too much like the dogs, and nothing like Emmett, who died before all of them out there in her yard, and for good reason. Emmett was the easiest to explain of all. Harriet poisoned him.
All right, now we're going to move on to a Q&A. So, Dr. T, do you want the microphone? There's an extra. All right, I can start us off with a question while you guys think of some. So, for your stories, was there anyone that had like a particular like fun inspiration behind it?
Can you repeat the question?
Was there any one of your stories that had like a particularly fun inspiration behind it?
Fun?
Or interesting, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know about fun. I do like to make something poetic out of the prosaic. So the last story is called Spaces. And the premise of the story is a man walks into a cafe and orders a slice of pie. And the challenge was to make that into an actual story. But the very first story is called Rise. And I don't want to spoil it, but it is something I happen to see happen in real life.
Thanks. Well, my book is nothing if not fun. It's been called the lighthearted romantic comedy of the summer. But I don't know, the one that pops to mind maybe is there's a story about a young woman who is going to visit her girlfriend, and the girlfriend lives above a restaurant that's a sort of fancy French restaurant in a part of town where there are a lot of valets taking up parking spots. And this sort of happened to me once. I was circling for hours trying to find a parking spot, and finally did, fighting with valets because they stand and keep the spots at this spot in Chicago. And finally got a parking spot, and then right as I was sort of outside the building, a guy pulled up in a Lexus and he threw me his keys. Like, I should park his car. And I really wanted to just drive off in the car. I didn't, but in the story, the woman does. So she's living out my fantasy, I guess. It was sort of fun.
So in The Stone and Bone Boy, I experienced something called a tonsillolith. And if you've never experienced a tonsillolith, you don't want to. But it was such a bizarre thing. I looked in the back of my throat, and I thought there was a tooth growing out of the back of my throat. It looked like a tooth. And I turned to my significant other at the time, and I said, I am a freak of nature. I've got a tooth growing out of the back of my throat. So that inspired the story of a little boy who was born expelling interesting things from his body.
Anyone in the audience with a question?
So, what has attracted you to the short story as a medium for your work? Like, why not something longer or shorter? Like, what is appealing to you about the short story?
I love short stories. I love novels. I read a lot of novels when I first started as a reader, and then I realized people keep coming to you, have you read this? Have you read that? Have you read this person? And I was like, no. And I realized I had to kind of focus, so I chose the short stories of the Americas. So Central, South America, North America short story as my interest for reading and keeping up on, because I realized I couldn't keep up on everything. And writing, I don't know, I love them. A lot of my favorite writers are short story writers as well.
What Cal said. I'll say more. I really like the punch, I just feel like with a great story, you sit down and 40 minutes later, or however long later, there's just this emotional impact, that you get in this little condensed thing that doesn't happen as much with a novel in that time frame. Maybe you get that over a longer span. And I don't know, I feel like it's a little closer to poetry in some ways, that it works more on what's not said and on imagery, and you just have a lot less space. So I think the artistry is appealing to me because you have to do a lot in a small amount of space.
Yeah, it's more compact. I mean, there's kind of a writing cliche that a novelist is a failed short story writer and a short story writer is a failed poet. So there's a little bit of that. One thing about it's easy to say, a novel is just a long story, and it's, and to conflate the two, because they both are narratives, they both have dialogue, they both have characters, they both have, sometimes they both have a plot, but they're really different. I think, the short stories need to be a little more organized and more concise. Not too many wasted words in a short story. Or paragraphs. If you, as an exercise, read a lot of short stories, like literary fiction, read like 3 issues of Granta or something, and then pick up a novel, and the arc is just completely, obviously different. And another reason I like short stories is they're short, and most people have time to read 3,000 words. They may not have time to read 90.
I was curious, were there any stories within these collections that went longer than you had originally expected them to? And if so, what were they and how did you handle it?
Could you repeat the last part of that question? If so, what?
If so, what were they and how did you handle it?
Yeah, sometimes a story demands more, and it either becomes a novella. You know, Fahrenheit 451 is a really good example of a novella that Bradbury tried really hard to make that into like a 7,000 word story, and he couldn't do it. He finally just gave in. This process was the opposite. I've had in this collection, I have many stories that are about half as long as they originally were. I think, you know, you give yourself the benefit of time to work through them. A lot of these stories are over 10 years old, and I came back to them time and again over the years and realized what was necessary, what wasn't. The final story that I mentioned earlier, Spaces, it finally occurred to me in June of this year that I was starting about 6,000 words too late. But when you do make that dramatic of a cut, I attribute it to backstory, because even if it doesn't go directly into the story, it bakes into the subconscious of the character, and that never leaves you as you write through that character's point of view and that perspective.
Yeah, I guess all my stories, I guess, like Steve, most of them started out way longer than they are here. And so that's just a process I've gotten used to, is that I know I'm going to cut it back, and it's always painful. It hasn't gotten any easier after years of doing it. An old teacher, a good friend of mine now, I remember saying, this really kind of helped me. He's like, you know, if you want to lose weight, you don't just drop 50 pounds in a month or something, right? It's you know, you're up and down, and you work at it, and it's sort of the same. I think that's a good way to think of the process. And then, you know, occasionally I have a story that I couldn't really cut down much more, and it became a novella. And it's not in this book. It was originally, but this was just getting too long, so I cut it out of that. Hopefully it'll be in something later. And I have another story I worked on that maybe will be a novel someday that just seemed like I can't cut it down. So, or those might just be failures, who knows?
So there's one story in here that is long. And my advice is be prepared for the editors to complain. That's one piece of advice. Two, when literary magazines say they publish short stories, look on Duotrope, which is a great tool, by the way. You can upload your story, how many words it is, and it'll send you the list of 3,000 that say they publish short stories, and their word limit is 1,500 words. Then they'll give you a list of about 2 magazines that'll publish anything over 7,000 words. So, you know, with the 10,000 word, the 15,000 word story, you maybe send them to anthologies instead of magazines. Anthologies that are calling out, looking for themes. That's worked for me for a couple of really long stories that nobody else wanted. And then you just love the editors and the people at Cornerstone Press who actually believe in those stories and will support those stories.
Two questions, one for all of you and one for Steve. Steve, this is your second collection of short stories. How was the process different, or your attitude different, in putting the first one together versus the current one?
Yeah, both stories collections came together pretty organically. The first collection I published is those stories a little bit more speculative, and they fit together better. These stories could not go really with any others, even though there is some overlap with characters. The characters always, I love my characters. Even if I kill them, I love them, and I'll write about them again, and they come back, and the page is always blank. You can do anything you want with it, right? But yeah, the process here, this collection was really hard to revise. I felt like, you know, sometimes Creek was really well received by a lot of people I had never met. And I read their reviews, and it's like, wow, they actually understood what I was doing here. And so I felt like I had to hit that mark with this one. But part of it, though, is the stories are so old that it kind of becomes like part of the woodwork. You know, you just can't see it anymore, so it's really more difficult to perceive, you know, what's harder. So it took more beta readers and some really tough questions on my part. You know, I printed out part of the book in a different font. I went somewhere I normally don't read. I did a lot of I read it all aloud. I did a lot of the cliche things that they talk about doing, and it actually does help. But it was, and I don't know if it's because it's a second collection or just the nature of the stories. It was harder, you know, because I needed them to be better than they had been where I left them off at 10, 12 years ago. I hope that answers your questions, Mike.
For all of you, when you're working on a short story, or perhaps you complete a short story, how does it change you in terms of your attitude toward how you interact with the world? How's that? Make
Wow.
sense? Does that make sense?
Geez, that's a big, it's a heavy question. I think kind of generally, it's the world doesn't like my answer, I think. I think that generally, I mean, writing generally, I don't know about a particular story, but generally it puts me in a state of mind that I like, you know, this kind of contemplative state. And if you are really working hard on a story, I think it's always there. You're always thinking about it. Whatever else you're doing, it's kind of there in the back of your head. And I like always having that happening. And then also, just in terms of character, you know, the way an actor might be a method actor and really try to sink into the character, I think you do that with stories as well. And so maybe, you know, it broadens your mind in some ways that, you know, you don't want your characters to be simple. So even somebody who might seem a certain way on the surface, you know, you really try to inhabit that person and walk in their shoes. So I think I would like to say it maybe makes you a little more understanding or empathetic generally. But for me, the big thing is like I like the state of mind it sort of puts me in.
So what I like about stories is putting myself in other people's feet. There are quite a few stories in here that are written from female perspective for whatever reason. There are also some stories that were just inspired as I went from place to place. One of my favorite things about travel is people, and just realizing the cultural context that other people live in is so different from our cultural context. And they're forced to make decisions and live in ways which are completely different from how we live. And to put ourselves in their positions and think about things on the larger scale. The story about a person in a dress ends up being about sexual tourism, and the story about a young boy playing the accordion for his chihuahua who has cancer as a street performer in Lisbon, Portugal, has something to do with post-colonial economics ultimately, right? So that's, I shouldn't say fun, but to think about the world's problems in a creative way and inhabit that and share those stories.
I can't decide if my perception of the world has more of an impact on my writing than my writing has an impact on my perception of everything else. I don't do a ton of research for my stories, but there are things I do need to learn. A fair amount of these stories deal with PTSD. EMDR is one of the treatments, so I had to look up how that works and do some research, you know, and figure out just so I could speak to it relatively intelligently and understand, you know, and be respectful of people who may engage in that kind of therapy. So when you learn new things about other experiences people are going through, you do become a little more aware of them. But like I said earlier, that sometimes I have a hard time shutting off that whole interconnectivity thing, and it sort of doesn't stop right down to a Teams meeting I have for work or something for Zoom. It's like I got to turn off my literary brain and listen to my boss talk about deploying a pod to Google clusters or something.
So I'll ask the last question, all right? We have a lot of students here, students in my classes and students that take other classes, and I'm always harping on them about influences, that writers don't write in vacuums, they write because they're influenced by other writers, influenced by teachers. So I'm wondering if you'd like to briefly talk about your teachers and writers that influence you and how they influence these books.
So I do a podcast. Raymond Carver, for those of you who know, Raymond Carver is obviously my favorite writer, but he's my favorite writer because I grew up in a small town called Eureka, California, and I realized he had actually lived in that town, and it was the first time that I'd read someone who I could relate to, because I loved Hemingway, I loved Kerouac, I loved all these people, right? But he was the first real human and had all kinds of problems and money and issues and things like that. So he's been a huge influence on me my whole life. Ross, I think, likes Hemingway. Hemingway's probably second to Carver, but for me, it's not just his writing style that interests me. But Hemingway was the first American author who I picked up, and I could read a different book of his set in a different country, a different short story set in countries he traveled around. So that was really inspiring to the kind of writing that's at least in this book. My other writing is a lot more realistic in another collection, but in here it's very kind of fanciful. Then it is the Latin American writers, and so the surrealist writers, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and the weirder stories of Haruki Murakami, the weirder stories of T.C. Boyle, et cetera. I really like a lot of kind of weird fiction.
Thanks. Well, teachers have been a huge influence, and I, as an undergrad, had a teacher named Robert Boswell whose writing I really liked, and so when I decided to get an MFA, I just looked up where he was teaching and followed. I'd never been to New Mexico, wound up in New Mexico, and there I had his wife, Antonia Nelson, who's another teacher, and she was a huge influence on me as well, and I just felt really lucky that I stumbled onto them. And then I had Lee K. Abbott for a teacher there too, who was an amazing teacher and a great guy, great writer. So, and I think there is that thing of, like, in terms of a human, as Cal was saying, like, I just thought writers were dead people up until a certain point, and then you meet these people and you're like, wow, I think their writing is every bit as good as anything I've ever read, and they actually still eat and breathe. So that's always good. In terms of other writers, like Stuart Dybek is a huge influence on me. In a similar fashion, he grew up a couple of miles from me. So I think, I heard somebody say once, you need a writer to give you permission to write. So whether that's somebody from Stevens Point or northern Wisconsin or from Port Angeles or, in my case, from the southwest side of Chicago, I kind of, growing up, thought, like, there's nothing story-worthy in my milieu, like there's nothing here to write about on the southwest side. But then I read Dybek and I thought, actually, somebody else might actually find this interesting. And then I know there's a lot of controversy swirling around Alice Munro right now, but Alice Munro has been a huge influence on me. Toni Morrison, William Trevor might be my favorite writer of all time. If you do yourself a favor, if you want to write, get yourself William Trevor's collected stories and just work your way through that. Like, that was sort of the Bible for me. It's a really great collection.
Cool. Yeah, man, there are like millions of writers you've never heard of, and they're all great, I kind of take this question into two parts. First, ones that influenced my writing. I was pretty heavily influenced by Latin American writers as well. I lived in Spain for 2 years. I lived in Argentina for 2 years. I lived in Brazil for one. My favorite book is called Rayuela by Julio Cortázar. He's from Argentina. The book title translates to hopscotch, And the nature of this book is, it's kind of like choose your own adventure. You finish a chapter and there's a number and you hop to the next one. It's a beautiful book. It's about exile. It's about art. It's about a lot of things written during a dictatorship. And I read it while traveling around the city for my job down there on a bus, and watched the interplay of all the lives weaving back and forth, people hopping around, and it kind of clicked for me there. The more contemporary writers, though, women seem to be dominating my preference for reading right now. Everyone from Louise Erdrich to Kelly Link, Karen Russell. I know I'm going to miss a few, but people like that. One thing that doesn't get mentioned that much with publishing when you start working on writing seriously is the kinship and the dialogue with other writers that really has an influence on you. May not affect the style of your writing, but it keeps you writing, and I think that's just as important. You know, I'll get a text message from somebody in Indianapolis, and there's my book, and they're in some bookstore you've never heard of, and there's sometimes Greek, and they're smiling and saying, "See, it's real. There's an ISBN number next to your name. Keep at it." You know, it's that kind of support too from colleagues that really means a lot.
All right, that is all the time we have for questions. So thank you all so much for coming, and we will be having a book signing and sale. So if you were interested in any of the stories you heard tonight, please come get a book from us. We'll be over there, and our authors will be signing. Thank you so much.